The notice came 3 weeks before the strikes. A form, a date, an address in the industrial district of your city where you were told to appear with 2 days of clothing and your national identification card. No explanation of what would follow, no timeline. The Islamic Republic does not explain. It instructs. You reported on a Tuesday morning in February. 40 men standing in a parking lot behind a building with no visible signage. Most were your age. A few were older, recalled from reserve status. Men with the particular expression of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. Nobody spoke about why they came. The reasons were obvious or they were private. Either way, not for a parking lot. The processing took 4 hours. Medical check, aptitude forms. You get a brief interview with an officer who asked 3 questions and wrote something you couldn't read. Then a room with cots and a window that faced a concrete wall. You put your 2 days of clothing in a locker that didn't lock. You lay down, you didn't sleep. That night the strikes began. You heard it before you understood it. The building moved in a way buildings aren't supposed to move. Then the alarms, then voices in the corridor, boots on concrete, someone shouting a unit designation you didn't recognize yet. You dressed in the dark because the lights had gone out. You stood in a hallway with 39 other men and waited for an order. The order came. It wasn't complicated. It never is at the beginning. Fall in, move out. The war has a position for you. You didn't know yet what the position would cost. The Basij recruiter had a beard and the specific confidence of a man who has never doubted a single thing he believes. He stood at the front of a room that smelled like cold concrete and read from a prepared text about resistance, about martyrdom, about the 40-year project of the Islamic Republic finally meeting its moment. He believed every word. You could tell because his voice didn't change when he said the difficult parts. Conviction doesn't modulate. You half believed it. That was enough. Half belief moves your legs in the same direction as full belief. Nobody checks the difference. Training was procedural. You ran. You carried things. You learned to field strip a weapon in the dark, which required more patience than strength and more repetition than either. The instructors were not cruel. They were efficient, which is a different thing. Cruelty implies personal interest. Efficiency just means you are a variable in a schedule. The barracks smelled like diesel and wet concrete, and the particular staleness of 50 men in a space designed for 30. The posters on the wall showed young men with clean uniforms and clear purpose. The men in your barracks had neither. They had boots that didn't fit, and a training rotation that started at 5 and didn't account for the fact that the water heaters failed every 3rd day. Nobody complained, not because of ideology, because complaining required energy that the schedule had already claimed. By the end of the 2nd week, you stopped thinking about home before sleeping. Not because you stopped missing it, because exhaustion is more efficient than grief. That was the first thing the Basij taught you. Not resistance, not martyrdom, efficiency. Your assignment came on a Thursday. Shade 136 Launch Unit, Avaz Region, under IRGC Aerospace Force Command. You were handed a technical manual and told you had 5 days to understand it. The manual was 340 pages. You read it twice. The unit was 12 men and 2 launch vehicles and a radio operator who had been doing this since before you were old enough to understand what IRGC meant. He didn't explain things. He demonstrated them once and expected you to have been watching. You watched. The war from this position was not what the posters showed. It was coordinates and launch windows and maintenance logs, and the particular anxiety of equipment that costs more than your father's house sitting in the desert heat that it wasn't fully designed for. You checked connections, you logged temperatures, you waited. Then came the night the Americans answered. The radar operator said nothing for 3 seconds after the returns appeared on his screen. 3 seconds is a long time when you understand what you're looking at. You didn't understand yet. You understood from his face. 40+ inbound, high altitude, stealth profiles that the S-300 was struggling to resolve into clean targeting solutions. The scale of it was administrative before it was frightening. The numbers were too large to feel immediately. Then the first impacts reached you as sound, distant and sequential, like a door being knocked on very hard, over and over, moving closer. Your launch orders came through. You executed the sequence. Somewhere above you, a Patriot battery converted your missile into a white flash. You thought the strait was your side's geography. It wasn't. Not that night. Not anymore. 8 men, 2 launch vehicles, one radio frequency that sometimes worked and one that didn't, which everyone knew about and nobody had fixed because the replacement part was on a truck somewhere between Tehran and Avaz, and the truck had been rerouted 3 times in 2 weeks. They looked at you when the orders came in, not because you had answers, because you had rank, which in the field is a different thing entirely. Rank means you receive the information first. It doesn't mean you understand it faster. You didn't know. You reacted faster than they did. That's the whole difference between a commander and the men he commands. The targeting data arrived as coordinates and a launch window. 40 minutes. You ran the sequence, checked the connections, confirmed the bird was ready. 6 of your 8 men knew what they were doing. Then 2 were learning by watching the other 6. You had been the same 2 weeks ago. The system replicates itself this way. Experience flowing sideways through a unit because there isn't time for it to flow from above. There was a man in your unit from Tabriz, 20 years old. He had a photograph taped inside his equipment locker. His younger sister at what looked like a university graduation. He checked it every morning before the rotation started. Not a ritual, just a habit. The kind of thing you do when you want to remember what the days are for. You noticed him because he was careful. Careful men are valuable. Careful men follow the sequence exactly, check twice, don't assume. You assigned him to the forward position because careful men belong at the most important station. That decision felt correct. It was correct. By every protocol you had been given, it was correct. The strikes ran every night for 11 days. Not dramatic. Operational. You received coordinates. You executed sequences. You logged results. You ran maintenance on equipment that was accumulating wear faster than the resupply chain could address it. War at this level is a logistics problem that occasionally reminds you it is also a violence problem. Mostly it is the logistics problem. By day 4, you stopped moving to the protected position when the alert sounded. Not because brave, because the protected position was 80 meters of open ground away, and the alert to impact window had compressed to the point where 80 meters was a decision that changed nothing except where you were standing when it happened. You stayed at the equipment. You kept working. The Strait of Hormuz operation ran parallel to everything else. Mining teams, all naval units. The economic logic of denying the world's oil corridor to the countries bombing your cities. You were one data point in that calculation. Your launch unit fed into a strike pattern that fed into a strategic objective that fed into a negotiating position that existed in a room in Tehran you would never enter. You didn't need to understand the room. You needed to execute the sequence. The paperwork was constant. Incident reports after every launch. Maintenance logs after every cycle. A daily readiness assessment that required you to evaluate equipment you already knew was degrading and write numbers that reflected operational reality without triggering a resupply request that would take 3 weeks to process anyway. You wrote accurate numbers. You submitted them. Nothing changed. By day 11, your unit had launched 43 times. You had slept a combined total of perhaps 30 hours. Your hands were steady. Your eyes were not. Nobody asked about the eyes. The drone strike came at 14 minutes past 2 in the morning. The position you had assigned him was the correct position. The alternative route had confirmed American ISR coverage. 2 Reaper signatures logged in the 48 hours prior, which meant anything that moved on that road was being watched and potentially targeted. The forward position had overhead cover, defilade from the most likely threat vectors, and was the assignment any commander working from the same data would have made. You know this because you have checked it every night since. The strike was a small munition, precision, the kind that arrives without sound and announces itself only in the past tense. By the time you understood what had happened, he was already beyond what the unit medic could address. 4 minutes. The medic worked for all 4 of them. Yet that's what medics do. They work until the math changes. He was 20 years old. The photograph of his sister was still in his equipment locker. You didn't know what to do with it, so you left it there for 6 days. Before a logistics rotation cleared the position and someone put it in an envelope addressed to Tabriz. You wrote the incident report that night. Correct assignment. Confirmed threat assessment. Decision within protocol parameters. All of it true. Every word accurate. Protocol doesn't help at 3 in the morning. You submitted the report. You received an acknowledgement. The war continued at its established pace because the war doesn't stop for accurate paperwork any more than it stops for anything else. His replacement arrived 4 days later. 19 years old, from Isfahan. He also had a photograph in his locker. You noticed. You didn't look at it. 200 men. You no longer launch personally. Your hands haven't touched a targeting sequence in 6 weeks, and some part of your nervous system hasn't understood this yet. Still running the pre-launch checklist at odd hours, fingers moving through the steps against your thigh while you sit in briefings about logistics and personnel rotations, and the administrative architecture of a war that has been running for 43 days. The martyr ceremonies have a structure. Portrait on an easel, black cloth beneath it, Revolutionary Guard's honor guard in pressed uniforms that contrast with everything else about the current situation. A cleric speaks. The mother sits in the front row. She holds herself very still, in the way that people hold themselves still when movement might break something that cannot be repaired. All you stand to the side in your dress uniform and say the words that the ceremony requires you to say. The words are not wrong. They are insufficient. There is a difference. You have written 11 condolence letters in 6 weeks. The template exists. You modify 3 sentences per letter to reflect the specific man, his unit, his duration of service. One detail that proves you knew he existed as something more than a personnel number. It takes 40 minutes per letter. You have gotten faster. You are not certain that getting faster is a good development. The phone calls are harder than the letters. Letters don't breathe. A mother on a phone call breathes, and sometimes the breathing changes. And you stay on the line because hanging up is the one thing you cannot do. And so you stay until she tells you to go. 3 of them thanked you. You don't know what to do with that either. The operations room is in a basement in Tehran. Fluorescent lights. 8 screens showing feeds from assets across the Gulf Theater. A coffee machine that stopped working on day 12 and has not been repaired because nobody has had 40 consecutive minutes to call the person who repairs coffee machines. You have been here for 3 weeks. You sleep 4 hours when the rotation allows it. Sometimes the rotation doesn't allow it. The screens show coordinates, grid references, occasionally a thermal feed where objects move in the particular way that means they are vehicles or personnel or infrastructure. You have learned to read the feeds without thinking about the second category. The strike request comes through the proper channel, verified coordinates, confirmed hostile designation, 2 signatures required. You provide the second signature, launch authorized. Something happens at those coordinates. You see it on the thermal feed for approximately 4 seconds before the feed whites out. Then the feed returns, and the thing that was there is not there in the same way anymore. You log the timestamp. You move to the next request. At 1900 hours, you leave the building. The air outside is cold and smells like a city that is still mostly functioning, which is more than the coordinates on the screen can say. You eat at the facility dining room. The food is adequate. You call your wife on a secure line. She asks how the day was. You tell her normal. She has stopped asking follow-up questions. Not because she doesn't want to know, because she has learned that normal is the ceiling of what this phone call can contain. And pushing past the ceiling doesn't open a door. It just damages the ceiling. Normal. The room where the Supreme National Security Council meets smells like old paper, and the particular stallness of decisions that have already been made before anyone sits down. You have been in this room 4 times. Each time the casualty figures on the table are larger, and the number of people willing to say the actual number out loud is smaller. Mojtaba Khamenei is 53 years old. He became supreme leader on the 8th of March, elected by an assembly of experts that had been bombed twice in the preceding week. He has his father's stillness, but not yet his father's authority, which is a thing that accumulates over decades and cannot be inherited directly. You watch him in meetings and try to assess whether the stillness is confidence or the absence of information. You have not determined which. A senior cleric asks you directly whether the resistance is achieving its strategic objectives. He uses the word resistance the way people use load-bearing words, words that are doing structural work that the sentence cannot do on its own. You tell him that Iranian forces have degraded American forward positioning in 4 of 7 targeted zones, that Strait of Hormuz transit has been reduced by 61%, that the economic pressure on Gulf states hosting American assets is measurable and ongoing. All of this is true. You don't tell him the other numbers. The ones marked with the classification level, that means they exist in 3 copies and none of them leave this building. He nods. He seems satisfied. Satisfaction is easier to produce than accuracy. Your left ear has been ringing since a building collapsed around you in a vase on day 19. The ringing doesn't stop. You have learned to hold conversations through it the way you learned to sleep through the launch alarms. You adapt. That's what the body does when the alternative is not adapting. You go home in May, not because the war ended, because your rotation ended, which is a different thing, and the war has opinions about the difference that it will share with you later. A ceasefire exists on paper. The paper is fragile. Everyone in the room where it was signed knows the paper is fragile. Nobody said this out loud, because saying it out loud doesn't serve the ceremony. Tehran is the same city, and not the same city. The buildings that were hit have tarps over them, or they have nothing over them. The ones with nothing are the ones where the paperwork hasn't caught up yet. There is a lot of paperwork that hasn't caught up. Your wife is still there. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the most significant logistical success of the past 3 months. She looks at you the way people look at something they are relieved to see but are not yet certain is undamaged. You understand the assessment. You are conducting the same one. Your son is 14. He watched the entire war on his phone. Every strike, every counterstrike, every viral video of intercepted missiles dissolving into white light over Dubai. He knows the names of American aircraft carriers. He knows the Shahed 136's range and payload. He learned the war from the outside while you learned it from the inside. And now you are in the same room. And the distance between those two educations is not a distance you can close by being present. He asks you what it was like. You tell him normal. The word comes out before you decide to say it. Somewhere in Tehran today, a conscription notice is being printed. A name is being typed onto a form, a date, an address. A young man who thinks he understands what the notice means. The office doesn't close. The notices keep printing. The loop has no exit that the paperwork acknowledges.